and welcome to the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce's second installment in the series COVID-19 Next Steps, Investing in the Brazilian Power Sector, Opportunities and Challenges. I am John Welch, Executive Director of the Brazilian American Chamber, and on behalf of the Chamber, we wish you all health and safety in this difficult time. We would like to also thank Machado, Meyer, and Advogados and Latham and Watkins for sponsoring this event. COVID-19 put several Brazilian infrastructure and privatization projects on hold. However, these themes are again figuring important for the country, few less salient than investment in the electricity sector. Today, we bring together a group of specialists in power generation to discuss upcoming opportunities in the power sector, as well as challenges of investing in the sector after the COVID-19 pandemic. Important issues include the impact on the upcoming power auction schedule and the Brazilian federal and Brazilian government policies. The panel will also discuss recent trends for the development of renewable power projects in Brazil and expected changes in the power regulatory framework under the Federal Working Group for Modernization in the Power Sector. I will now briefly introduce the speakers. You can find the full bios of the panelists on the invitation link and on the Chamber website. Our moderator today is Karina de Souza, partner at Machado Meyer. She is a specialist in infrastructure and energy with focus on projects and transactions involving private investment in regulated sectors, including concessions, privatizations, administrative and regulatory law, and project finance. She holds a Bachelor's of Law from the Universidade de São Paulo, a postgraduate degree in Economic and Corporate Law from Fundação Getúlio Vargas, and LLM from New York University. Our speakers are, first, Adi Blum, Managing Director at BlackRock. He's a member of the Global Energy and Power Infrastructure team at BlackRock, which currently manages over $8 billion for investment in the power, midstream, utility, and other areas in the energy sector across 3 long-term funds. Mr. Blum earned a BS from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and an MBA from New York University Stern School of Management. Christopher Cross, partner Latham and Watkins, is a corporate and finance transactional lawyer and is co-chair of the Energy, Oil, and Gas Industry Group. He's also a member of the Africa, Latin America, Mergers and Acquisition, Private Equity, and Project Finance practices. Mr. Cross represents companies, government institutions, sovereign and private equity funds, and lenders in the international joint venture acquisition, project development, and financing transactions, primarily in the energy extractive industry and infrastructure sectors. Mr. Cross holds a BA from Dartmouth College and a JD from Columbia University School of Law. Our next speaker is Igor Cadete Fonseca, who is head of power project finance at Santander and has worked with Santander's project finance team since 2012, after 2 years working at HSBC and Credit Agricole. At Santander, he covers the power sector with the execution of several financial advisory and arranging mandates amounting to investments in over 50 billion reais and total installed capacity over 20 gigawatts, including large hydroelectric, gas-fired thermal power plants, wind farms, small hydros, photovoltaic, and concentrated solar power plants in Brazil. Mr. Fonseca holds a BA in Business Administration from the Faculty of Economics from FEA in the University of São Paulo. He's a native Portuguese speaker and is fully proficient in English and Spanish. Bruno Prado Suarez is Secretary for Strategic Works and Development from the Brazilian government's Investment Partnership Program, the PPI. Previously, he was Federal Auditor of Finance and Control of the National Treasury Secretariat, Director in Special Secretariat for Privatization, Divestment, and Markets of the Ministry of Economy, or also known as SEST, and Deputy Secretary of State for Finance of Minas Gerais. He has also held several board positions at CEMIG. Mr. Leal holds a bachelor's degree in economic sciences from Federal University of Minas Gerais and a master's degree in economic theory from the University of São Paulo. And finally, Liliana Yang is head of Latham Utilities, Oil and Gas Petrochemicals Research at HSBC, a former colleague of mine. She has covered the Latham utility sector since 2000 as a sell-side analyst based both in São Paulo and New York, while working for several global firms. She joined HSBC Global Research from UBS. Before that, she worked at JP Morgan and Bear Stearns. Ms. Yang holds a bachelor's in economics from the University of São Paulo and speaks fluent Portuguese and English. Before turning the screen over to Ana Karina, I would ask you to please use the Q&A tab for questions. You can make them at any time, and we will look to answer them after the panel discussion during the Q&A period. Thank you very much, and thank you all for joining. Ana Karina?
Thank you, John, for your words. Thank you all for joining this debate. It's my pleasure to share this panel today together with other prominent players of the international community investing or doing business in Brazil. As you all know, Brazil is a Latin American country with continental dimensions and a population expected to reach 200 million by the end of 2020. At the closing of 2019, the country had approximately 170 gigawatt in installed capacity for generation projects, with more than 75% from renewable sources. In terms of investment in infrastructure in Brazil, the power sector is one of the leading sectors attracting private investment into the country today, counting on a solid regulatory framework entirely regulated at federal level, with solid institutions including the National Electric Energy Agency, ANEEL, the National System Operator, ONS, the Electric Energy Commercialization Chamber, CCE, and the Energy Research Company, EPE. Based on the 10-year expansion plan published by EPE, the expected average growth of power demand in Brazil is 2.5% average per year, with a total 18% growth in 10 years. Such growth is expected to be driven not only by the expansion of centralized generation projects, but by self-production projects and distributed generation projects, with a relevant participation of renewable sources, including wind and solar. Since 2017, the Brazilian federal government has promoted a modernization reform of the power sector, aiming at attracting additional investment opportunities to incentivizing the increased development of the so-called free market commercialization environment, among other initiatives. Measures already undertaken under the modernization reform include the approved change in the methodology for pricing of the spot market, the PLD, starting 2021, as well as the gradual lifting of minimum thresholds for consumers to be able to buy energy from other trading agents. It is still unclear how the COVID-19 will impact the 10-year term projections of growth of the Brazilian power sector. In any case, the Brazilian federal government has already announced in different occasions that private investment in infrastructure shall be one of the leading forces driving Brazil's economic recovery in the near future. The Brazilian Investment Partnership Program, the PPI, contemplates a series of privatizations and auctions in the short term. We will have the opportunity to hear from Bruno now the plans of the federal government in relation to the privatization and investment opportunities in the Brazilian power sector, and the expected return of generation and transmission power auctions in the near future. Last but not least, Bruno will also convey which measures the Brazilian federal government has adopted so far in order to mitigate the impacts of the COVID-19 in the power sector, especially in relation to Brazilian power utilities and the recent financing scheme that was arranged in coordination with private banks in Brazil and the Brazilian federal government. After Bruno's 10-minute presentation, we will start the debate with the participation of Ari from BlackRock, Igor from Santander, Lily from HSBC, and Chris Cross from Latham. Please, Bruno, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to show what the Brazilian government have been done in the power sector. I will use a presentation here to help and guide us. See the presentation. Yeah. First of all, we in PPI, we work as a hub for investments. We act a one-stop shop for investors and stakeholders inside of the government, facilitating the investment, the private investments on services made by the public services and goods. For the power sector, first of all, it's important to give you an overview of how the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the sector. It's well known that the pandemic hit the global economy abruptly and severely. Market expectations for Brazil GDP is a drop of 6.5% this year. This downturn has two effects on the power sector: a consumption decrease and an increase of the default. The effects began to appear in Brazil in mid-March. So here in this slide, we have a comparison of energy consumption of the pandemic period with the same month of last year. We can see a drop of about 10% in consumption on average. Also, during the pandemic period, non-payments of electricity invoices grew from 3 to 10% of the total revenue. In the power sector, these effects primarily affect distributors, but revenue frustration puts the entire production chain at risk. These figures try to illustrate the effects perceived in the distributors. A downturn leads both a reduction on energy consumption and an increase in default. Combined with these effects, we found our market over-contracted and with a low short-term price. It is estimated that companies will end the year with up to 16% of leftover energy. So probably they will have a loss since they purchased energy on long-term auctions at a price higher than the current one. All this together, summing up, is a negative result the discourse for the distributors companies. This loss for the distributor would be passed on to consumers. So to mitigate the effects, the federal government acted quickly and adopted a series of measures, notably the release of funds retained from our system service charge in the amount of 2 billion reais, the consumer segment, just to mitigate the price of the energy that will go to the consumer. Exemption for about 10 million for low-income consumers at a cost of 900 million for our national treasury and about 300 million for our account CDE. And an authorization for the cleaning house, the CCE, to contract a credit of about 16 billion reais to be deferred in tariff reviews over 4 to 5 years. This is what Karina said, the COVID account. So just to mitigate the short-term impact on the tariffs, the government authorized the distributors to hard this credit. In our agents, ANEL, it will defer the tariff reviews and establish the amounts that each distributor will pay over the next 5 years. So we will not have a short-term impact, but it will be deferred on 5 years on the tariffs for the consumers. Also, we in PPI, we work on concessions of infrastructure and also on the privatization of SOEs. And the federal SOE of our sector, the Eletrobras, it's on the way to be privatized. And there is a process for it. I don't know if I'm going too fast. There is a process for this privatization, and what are we doing right now? The COVID didn't impact this privatization for Eletrobras. we still need the approval of the draft bill by the Congress. So, so the COVID didn't impact it right now. It's not a bottleneck for us. Eletrobras is a priority for the government. We expect that the bill will soon be passed on the Congress and we will be able to carry the capitalization, not followed by the government. What will result in the loss of control by the state will be not an SOE anymore. And we estimate that this privatization will be completed by 2021. The main features of the bill and the privatization itself are issuance of new shares, not followed by the government, a pulverization of shares in voting power, so it will be a corporation company, changing the regime from quota for independent production, the destination of part of the concession fee for reduction of charge, so to minimize the impact for the consumers. In this process, Itaipu, our binational enterprise with Paraguay and Eletronuclear, will remain SOEs public, but all the Eletrobras will be privatized with government with expressive strategic amount of shares of Eletrobras, but without voting power more than 10%. I think it's good to pass on the current PPI portfolio. I'm missing a slide here about our perspective of consumption energy. Sorry, but we already estimate energy demand five years ahead to drop about 5%. So government with this new estimate of 5% of drop of energy, we postponed our generators auctions to be carried these years. It was about uncertainty regarding not only the size of the effects, but also the duration and intensity of the pandemic. So, of course, it led the government and said that it would be more appropriate to postpone the actions of new and existing energy schedule. Our energy demand for 5 years has been reduced, and in the face of new estimates about future energy demand, the agents, the sector of the power sector and the ministry are evaluating the timing to resume the actions for generations. At the end of August, they are due to present a new schedule for the generation action to be held this year or on the beginning of the next year, but they will release this new schedule on August with more information, accurate information about what we can expect for the demand of energy 5 years ahead. But in the transmission segment, not in the generation, but in the transmission segment, we are working with the possibility of an auction in December of this year or in the early beginning of the next year. In December, more probably in December of this year, with a lot of 15 lots of projects, what represents up to 10 billion reais of investments. So we are already resuming our auctions on the power sector, with the generation side with a bit uncertain yet. That we'll have more information on August, But on transmission lines, we are already preparing the auction. And what we see is other opportunities that exist in the power sector that are privatization of state companies, state level companies, like C3E on the south, and private mergers and acquisitions. Federal government supports the privatization of the state level companies. So what we can have the message here is we still working. The pandemic didn't affect our work to make private opportunities for the sector power sector. We are more than ever, we need the privatization of Eletrobras. Like I said, is a priority for the government. The pandemic didn't affect the schedule. We are still waiting for the bill to be approved by the Congress. But what I can say is the privatization was a priority before. Now it's still a priority. It urges to be done, the privatization of Eletrobras. And it didn't affect our work to give market opportunities, but some of the actions we have to postpone, waiting for more information about the demand. Because like I said, our distributor market was with 16% of leftover energy, and we don't know how much of energy, new energy, we will have to provide on the short term. So this is what we've been done, and thank you. That's it. Thank you. I hope to if there is any questions.
Thank you, Bruno. Thank you for the clear and helpful presentation. We will have the opportunity to ask specific questions to Bruno in the Q&A feature as the debate progresses. But now what I would suggest to start the discussions with Adi from BlackRock. Adi, please feel free to ask any questions to Bruno, but I have one specific question to you. And that would be whether, in your view, has the COVID-19 created any additional opportunities for investment in Brazil, in your understanding, or otherwise, has it made more difficult for investment decisions to be taken?
It's a good question. Thanks, Anna. Good to see you. Good to see everyone else on the panel. And great presentation, Bruno. That was very informative. And I think encapsulates a lot of the things that we're seeing right now in Brazil. I would say the answer to your question is both. Created additional opportunities as well as created additional challenges at the same time. I would say over the past few years, amongst Latin America and amongst the world, Brazil has been one of the largest pipeline of new investment opportunities. And it's been a combination of new forms of generation, new builds, greenfield projects, but also operating assets that have been sold for a variety of reasons, whether it's distressed by the parent companies or just looking to rotate assets. So in today's investment environment, that's amplified with the need for capital, and the financing markets in Brazil have been impacted. So there continues to be a robust need for equity. So it particularly related to power generation, and all along the chain of power generation, the COVID has, as Bruno said, significantly impacted demand. Delinquencies are up. The government allowed distribution companies or mandated that distribution companies can't cut off customers who don't pay for some period of time. I believe that's been extended throughout July. which has in turn led to more delinquencies, which has put pressure on the distribution companies. But we have been happy to see that the government's been, and Enel's been very proactive in creating this liquidity fund, as well as the call for an extraordinary tariff in the coming couple months that should help stabilize the sector over the long term. So that's helpful. Some of the challenges that we try to evaluate are, exactly what Bruno said. What's demand going to look like for the long term? What does that mean for long-term power prices? Where can you recontract PPAs in the future? And then it's other things that might not be apparent today, like, are there going to be increased taxes in the future? Might be other fees, other changes to the system that might impact an investment today, that might change what you put in a model today and don't anticipate for the future. So we try to balance all of that, and there are investment opportunities that we're currently pursuing, and that we would if we're able to get there on the terms, look to transact even in this market. I'll save currency for a little later, because that tends to be the biggest issue we face, COVID notwithstanding, in Brazil. But I'll park that for the moment.
Thank you very much, Ari, for your insights and your words. It's very interesting to hear from the investor perspective on how Brazil landscape looks like today, from an international perspective. But before we jump into the debate a little bit further about currency, as you suggested, I would pass to Igor from Santander, and I will start asking Igor if he could share a few highlights about the COVID-19 financing recently structured, and more generally, Igor, how you see private banks' role in Brazil in the recovery of the economy, especially in the context of the COVID.
Well, thank you, Ana, Karina, and thank you all the hosts and my fellow panelists. It's a pleasure to talk with you today. Addressing your first question, and my colleagues have already made an introduction about it, I would say that we are in the very, very late stage of finalizing the structuring of the COVID account, which is the liquidity being provided by the banks to the power system in Brazil. This has been already quite some time since all the discussions began, because it always started with the publish of a provisional measure by the federal government about 2 to 3 months ago, and ever since there has been quite an open debate among the distribution companies, the regulatory agency, the Ministry of Mines and Energy, and the banks, trying to find a structure on which, most of the stakeholders' interests would be somehow protected. And it's quite I'm quite proud to say that I think the whole regulatory framework and the willing for the parties to find solutions is what is making us to move forward in such a challenging environment. So just a very quick step back. The point on the Brazilian financial markets right after the COVID crisis started, we had a big rush of companies towards the banks looking for liquidity. So trying to withdraw revolving credit facilities, working capital lines, obviously because everyone was in a very uncertainty moment on how long and how deep would be the effects of the crisis. And this has obviously provoked a liquidity crisis, I would say, not necessarily a credit crisis, but a liquidity one. So capital was more scarce and was also more expensive, right? And in that moment, we started discussing with the government which type of transaction could be considered for the banks as a good credit quality, so that they were willing to provide funds in such an uncertainty moment. And what we are, well, getting close to finalize is something which I consider very successful, which is providing a reasonably long-term transaction. We're talking about 5 to 6 year facility in a very large amount. We're talking something around 16 billion Brazilian reais in this environment still of a lot of uncertainty. And this has been, we're being able to achieve that most importantly because of the regulatory framework that we have behind the Brazilian power market and the whole arrangements that make the lenders comfortable enough to provide that type of funds. And Santander is an international bank, but with a large local presence. We are very confident on the legal background of our system. So this transaction, Anna, basically, I think that the beauty of it is that at one point of view, it is an off-balance sheet transaction for the distribution company. So it will not be as a financial indebtedness for the distribution company. So it should not affect their own covenants that they have on their debt transactions. And at the same time, a little bit different than a previous transaction, which was done in 2014, which is the Conta ACR. This transaction will not necessarily be paid 100% by the final consumers, because what ANEEL will do on the upcoming tariff reviews, they will basically well analyze which part of the impacts of the crisis is related to the on distribution companies concession regulation and which part is not. So even though the consumers, they will pay this additional tariff to make sure that the loan being contracted will be repaid, these may be subject to further adjustments between distribution companies and final consumers. So it's not like a solution that simply is putting all the burden into the final consumer. So I think this is a very important point. And I think from the lender's perspective, and this is also to address your second question. So in terms of what role the private banks in Brazil they have to play on this transaction, well, the negotiations are still on course, but it will be very likely that private banks will hold more than a half of the final transaction volume. So this is we're really talking about a new momentum in Brazil, and a momentum on which the private players, they are playing a more important role than simply state-owned banks. And this, I think it shows a little bit the confidence that Brazil has been able to gain with many other international lenders like Santander, or large local lenders as some of our competitors. And this, from the bank's point of view, this transaction, it is important, not only by itself, it has to be a transaction with good credit mitigants, so that we'll have not only the final tariffs being charged to the consumers, but we'll have reserve accounts, liquidity buffers, extraordinary quota reviews, and so on. But more than that, this transaction represents, from the bank's point of view, as a way to provide liquidity to the distribution companies, to make sure that, as Bruno has pointed out, the financial flow will keep sustaining the whole chain among generation and transmission, because not only BNDES, but also the private banks in Brazil, they have a very large exposure to the power sector. And for us, this transaction also represents a way to keep liquidity into all parts of the chain, and to make sure we will not have the impacts of delinquency going all the way down to the generation and to the transmission side. So this is a way that the banks play a role to help the whole system, maintaining stability, and to allow that new transactions, new opportunities, and new auctions or new M&A transactions, they are able to be held in a less uncertainty environment. So just as a final message on those points you raised, Ana Karina, I think this has taken a little bit longer than initially everyone expected. But after ANEEL published the final resolution last week, we're now really much on the final steps, and we do expect to get the disbursement in the upcoming weeks.
Thank you, Igor. Thank you and congratulations for the signing, the closing of the transaction, of the financing. I think it brings a big relief to everyone in the power sector, especially the power utilities, right? As you mentioned, it mitigates the need of getting finance and bringing additional leverage to the distribution companies by way of having, as you commented, CCE being the main borrower under this transaction, right? So that's perfect. Thank you very much. I'll pass now to Lily from HSBC, and I will start by asking Lily if, in Lily's understanding, how did investors in the power sector react to the COVID-19, and how does the Brazilian power sector compare to investment in other countries of Latin America?
Hi, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Ana Karina, John Welsh, for the invite. I'm very glad I can be here listening to what the other panelists are saying. I'm learning a lot. As for your questions, so how did investors react in the power sector to the COVID-19? I'll say that, first of all, I could maybe separate the investors into the corporates and then the equity investors. I'll say from the corporate side, for sure, there was a lot of concern because different from the 2011, 2001 or 2 rationing crisis, different from the 2013 and 14 financial crisis for the sector, this is a cross-sector crisis, right? And as Adi alluded to, it's a big impact on the macro environment of Brazil, rising political risks as well. And you can see that it's all about the currency too, right? But going back to the corporates, they first had to stop and reassess if they were thinking about dividends versus capex. With the crisis, they had to stop and say, well, now I have to preserve cash. It's a question of, making sure that their clients are well paid, that they themselves will be able to go through this crisis that nobody knew if it would be a 1-month impact, 4-month impact. So is it a 5 billion impact to the sector? Is a 20 billion real impact to the whole sector, right? Because you're focusing more on the generation, on the power sector, more than distribution transmission, right? And because Igor also explained well the impact to the distribution companies. I'll just highlight that with the COVID-19 sector loan, yes, we are seeing, the government avoiding a systemic risk here. So I think generation companies, they'll be mostly fully paid. And really 70% of the contracts are with the regulated market. I really see limited risk here of generation power companies not getting paid here, right? Then the other maybe almost 30% or 28%, 25% is the free market contract. In that case, if you follow the contracts, the power companies usually have some 10 to 15% of volume flexibility. So it's a question of not being necessarily paid in a particular month, but having the hope of being paid in the future. But in any event, they have a very limited impact on the revenue stream for the month or for the month 2, right? So I think that power corporates are very alleviated now to hear that the COVID-19 loan is being implemented. I think it's a question of days, so that's great. To be honest, the concern is really now on the electricity distribution companies, right? Because they are the ones who collect 100% of the bill. They only keep 20%. If demand reduction is 10%, delinquency is almost 10% down, they pretty much have zero EBITDA on month number 1, right? On an aggregate level, right? So they don't have enough to pay, maybe for the personnel, material, third-party expenses. And for sure, they have economic profit being severely impacted. But it's another question, I think, is a pending issue to be resolved between the regulator, the government, and the distribution companies. As for the power companies, I think they are in a better shape. And if I take a bigger picture and look at power companies versus distribution companies, at least for the listed companies, right, they are in pretty good financial liquidity. They have very low leverage, right? And they have actually already lowered their earnings payout. And even the companies that announced 100% of payout back early in January or February, they went back and said, sorry guys, no, it's 56% payout because I need to preserve cash and make sure their consumers, the free customers, are gonna face the crisis together with them, right? To emerge stronger, right? So that's maybe the first thing. If I can go then shift to the equity investors, they certainly panicked. So you could see through the stock prices, pretty much in late March when the lockdown in Brazil started through early April, when you had no clarity about the actions taken by the government or the companies, for those who didn't know how the regulatory framework works, and by the way, it's a very robust, solid framework in Brazil, more than 20 years of history. Some step backs, but now I think it's going on the positive direction. So for the equity investors, really, the stock prices went down and they were reflecting like a 500 basis points Brazil CDS. And just to illustrate, we're seeing valuation of utilities in general, the equities in Latham or Brazil, trading with an implicit Brazil CDS of about 150 basis points in January, then going through valuation reflecting 500 basis points CDS. And today, actually, the recovery is there. I would say that in real BRL terms, the stock prices are pretty much the same levels of pre-pandemic. However, in dollar terms, as Ari said, we cannot ignore the currency here. Many of the stocks are trading at 30, 35% down year to date because it is reflecting the weaker FX, the weaker BRL is reflecting maybe about 300, 250, 350 basis points Brazil CDS in the valuation, right? But if I can summarize, right? Power companies, the listed ones, they are pretty much in good shape. They have actually good financial support, good balance sheet. They have very excellent investment discipline. Transmission companies, for sure, they are in an even safer, situation because they have zero volume risk, zero delinquency risk, almost zero, right? And electricity distribution companies are today, still in the negotiation process to try to make themselves whole, because what we see today is working capital is not going to be an issue, but what about economic profits, right? There's a question mark that I think that, still needs to be addressed, right? By the regulator, by the government. And I'm actually confident that the outcome should be better because, it's bringing up a lot of discussion about several legal disputes that we have seen in the sector for a few years that need to be addressed. Maybe it's going to be the time, right? And even if I can make a parallel to your question, Ana Karina, about how the sector compares, with other, sectors, I would say that electricity power, they actually do benefit from this robust environment. And what we're going to see today is maybe a focus of the government, for instance, in the water utility sector, right? Which, to be honest, has what? Instead of one federal regulatory agencies, one federal agency has 50 agencies, right? Has no rule of law. It took, I think, the government more than 12 years to come from the initial set of legislation to say capex in water infrastructure needs to be paid for by tariffs, to come with the recently, approved federal sanitation bill. So that's where I think that things can get better in other sectors. To be honest, in electricity power sector, it's more a question of fine-tuning the model and negotiating, and coming with a, technical agreement about, how to make companies fully whole or at least partially whole, right? Maybe you asked me one thing that I didn't answer, which is maybe how to compare the power sector in Brazil versus other countries in Latin. I would just highlight that many countries, being Mexico, being Chile, they all have gone through a crisis and a review of their regulatory framework. When the crisis goes beyond sector crisis, when it gets to a macroeconomic, political maybe crisis or social crisis, right? And this is what it seems like we're seeing. So we see that in Mexico, maybe it's maybe a little bit against renewables. It's more towards the strengthening of the power of the SOEs. I think we're seeing the opposite in Brazil. And, thank you, Bruno, for highlighting that, that you guys, the whole government is focused on still the privatization of Electrobras is a very important piece. The electricity distribution sector is maybe 9% already private run, while for generations more than 50% is still state-owned run, right? It's not 60%. So this is maybe one contrast. But one important thing is prices or tariffs in Brazil are in reais, BRL denominated, and cash flows are mostly BRL denominated, right? While in some countries like Colombia or even Chile or you can argue Peru, they're all dollarized, right? So this is maybe something to think of. In Brazil, it's only partially dollarized with a lag, right? Depending on how inflation captures maybe the BRL depreciation. I think I talked too much, so. I'll let you go ahead.
Thank you, Lily, for the insightful analysis. It was really interesting and really encompassing, the full picture of the power sector. Thank you very much. So I take this opportunity to pass to Chris. So I would ask Chris, whether Chris, in your experience, you believe that cross-border transactions have somehow been impacted, and specifically going to the point about currency, how you believe currency risk could be addressed in Brazil.
Thanks, Karina, appreciate it. And thanks to John and the rest of the team. Lily, you're a tough act to follow. That was an incredibly dense presentation. And I was scribbling notes furiously. I think I'm going to echo a couple of themes that Adi, Bruno, Igor, and Lily have touched upon. First of all, just from a transaction execution perspective, because the first issue is, that you asked me, Karina, is what has COVID-19 done to cross-border transactions? And like Lily, I look at it in a couple of different buckets. One, big boy strategics, like the kind of people that would play in the offshore wind space, folks that would come in and potentially provide private power to industrial customers, right, in the renewable sector, folks who are interested in utility scale generation, and then the private equity and sovereign equity investors. And I think the good news is that the momentum that the sector had, for all the reasons that Bruno and the rest of the panelists have described from a regulatory perspective, the resiliency of the regulatory framework, the innovation that's being shown in the sector, has kept the momentum which existed pre-COVID going forward into, I think, the current time. And at least from our perspective and our clients' perspective, we think that's going to continue well into the fourth quarter and into 2021. The interesting thing about COVID, to pick up a theme that I think Adi first introduced, is it's definitely increased the amplitude of people's concerns that they would normally have investing, particularly in the generation sector. I won't touch the disco sector because, at least from the perspective of folks that we're working with, people are a lot more focused on the potential cash flows that are coming from generation that, as Lily pointed out, face a lot less of the credit, counterparty risk concerns and structural concerns. To the extent that folks are still moving forward, I think the challenges they're facing are the following. First of all, in deals that we had signed up before COVID hit, or ones that had good momentum, I think we needed to get through investment committee and credit committee second thoughts. So as soon as COVID hit, people took a step back, took a hard look, looked at contracts to see whether or not an MAE had occurred. We had a lot of discussion and debate in different states with respect to generation assets as to whether an event of force majeure had actually occurred. There was some legal disagreement, between the federal regime and specific state regimes that would guide whether or not an equity investor or a credit committee would continue to wish to invest in that project. But the kinds of folks that are committed to the sector move forward and wrestled with the same issues that they have all the time: FCPA, environmental, permitting, right? Ultimate credit, counterparty, and solvency risk, and then generally the regulatory risk that I think Bruno and Karina have very eloquently addressed. The regulatory sector, as Lily pointed out, has been a known quantity. The way this market works has been a known quantity for several decades. COVID has not changed that. What COVID has changed is people's stress testing of their economic models and stress testing of their counterparty, off-taker, or customer credit risk. And it's caused people to take another look at some of the other fundamental issues that I mentioned, like permitting, environmental, and FCPA risk. So people are just slowing down. Just from a deal maker's perspective, having a management meeting, conducting due diligence, walking around a site, convening an investment committee or a credit committee meeting with some of the people from the client side is incredibly challenging. The dynamic has changed incredibly, and it slowed things down. So I think you'll definitely see a backlog of transactions moving into the fourth quarter of this year and into 2021. To turn quickly to the FX question, I think, Karina, it's always the question of the day for any of these transactions. Where we have PPAs, at least in the private sector, which are either indexed or dollar denominated, where we have a robust source of export revenue from the off-taker, I think there you're going to continue to see a lot of contractual resiliency. I think people will take a hard look at their recontracting risk, right, for those companies, but they're basically taking a secular view of whether that industry is going to continue to thrive within COVID and after COVID. But those deals that don't have some kind of FX resiliency or are not denominated in dollars or do not have indexation, I think are going to face even more challenges now. I think people are taking a very tough look at the way Brazilian currency risk is playing out under COVID. So mindful of the time, I'll now turn it back to Ana Karina and John for any questions from the group.
Sure, thank you very much, Chris. So before we jump into the questions, I'll just ask Gabriela from Information. Information is our media partner from this event. Gabriela, would you like to mention a few words before we jump into the questions?
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Can you hear me well?
We can hear you.
Okay. So I want to thank you, Machado, Meyer, and Latham, Watkins, and the Chamber for this opportunity. So I work with Information with our Latin American team in Brazil. What we do is we provide a market intelligence service. We map transactions in infrastructure and electricity opportunities for investors. We have a team worldwide, and I'll be delighted to discuss Brazilian opportunities and the projects over here with you all afterwards. And if you have any questions about our service and if you would like to take a trial, please be in contact. I also would like to take this opportunity to make a question for you, if I'm allowed to. I'd like to hear your impressions about the brownfield market, because we are seeing, especially in renewables, some greenfield projects moving forward, but the brownfield is not going anywhere. So I'd like to hear what are your thoughts about the brownfield market in Brazil, especially transmission and generation.
I'm happy to hop in on that, as we're currently looking at a number of brownfield opportunities. I guess a challenge. I mean, valuation expectations are always a challenge, but drilling down deeper on that, what we've the sticking point historically has been what happens after the PPA expires. What are you going to recontract the PPA for, and what are spot prices going to be during the course of the PPA? And historically, there's been this view, particularly from sellers, that prices are going to perpetually rise with inflation. And something I'd always say is look back historically, and has that really been the case? But the winners of assets have generally had to subscribe to that assumption to win an auction. And I think now in today's environment that assumption is less credible, considering demand is going to be low for a lot longer than expected, and as a result, at least spot prices should be lower, and contracts on new PPAs might be lower as well. But to the question, we are seeing activity in the brownfield space. It's just there's been so much greenfield activity that maybe that's overwhelmed what's been happening in brownfield.
Thank you, Adi. Thank you for your comments. So John, do we have any questions from the public, or would you like to ask any specific question?
We have one question, and it's It's a little bit away from the technical parts. It's more of a political question. The bill, as Bruno put out there, has been kind of stuck in Congress. The model was decided on, negotiated, and the question is, you know, what do the politics look like in terms of getting these things in a regulatory framework, and a rather novel one through Congress?
Yeah, John, I'll take that one. I think in terms of regulation, I think a big part of the job was done with the regulation of the COVID-19 account, right, which will bring immediate relief, liquidity relief to the distribution companies. But it's still, as Igor pointed out, you know, there are other concerns of the federal government, of course, in relation to the crisis. And one of them is to avoid a sudden increase of power tariffs in Brazil, right? Because that would also hurt the economy as a whole, right? So from a regulatory perspective, the government is still studying, and maybe Bruno, maybe Bruno could be the best person also to complement that. I understand that the federal government is still envisaging other measures to deal with the impact of the COVID-19 in the utilities companies mostly, including possible rebalancing of the economic and financial equation of the concession agreements with the DISCOs. So there's a public consultation process in place now that is expected to take to start soon. It has not started yet, but it's expected to start within the next weeks. That will discuss, you know, the overall impact of COVID-19 in the distribution company. So COVID-19 liquidity account was a major and very important remedy, but it's not sufficient, you know. So at the moment, what's being discussed from a regulatory standpoint is, you know, how to assess, you know, and how we can assess and how we can address the impact as a whole of the COVID-19, which is a very difficult task, by the way, you know, because COVID-19 isolation measures are still in place in many states in Brazil, right? So it's not possible at this moment, you know, to have a clear and complete picture, you know, about the impacts because the COVID-19 are still going on, you know. And in terms of legislative news, what we have is the modernization reform of the power sector. So there is a bill of law that's being discussed in the Brazilian Congress that will bring additional competitiveness to the free market with expected, you know, lifting of a minimum demand for consumers to be able to buy from, you know, other utilities or other trading agents in Brazil, as well as the review of the concession framework as a whole, but from a good perspective. It's basically an improvement perspective. There will be no relevant changes in the framework, but mainly improvements to the concession regime, especially hydros. Bruno, would you like maybe to complement me and convey a few words about, you know, how is the legislative scenario in Brazil on the power sector?
Thank you, Ana. You gave us a very good picture. Indeed, it's a hard task to measure on this uncertainty of the COVID. We are in the middle of the pandemic here, so there's a lot of uncertainty on the market. But we don't need the Congress to discuss this hard task that Ana Karina explained. It's conducted by our regulatory agents. But as Ana Karina said, we are confident in the bill of law that is in the Senate. It's a proposal by Senate that will improve and modernize our sector. And Eletrobras. We are very confident that on the end of the day, the Congress will respond quickly and effectively, approving the bill to allow us to privatize Eletrobras, and it will improve our investments in the market, because one of the problems for Eletrobras that hold the major share of the market is a lack of government support for investments. So we need to capitalize Eletrobras, and here in Brazil, we will count on the private sector, not on the public sector anymore. But the message is that on the end of the day, the Congress gave us, like they gave us on the COVID measures, quickly response for the government demands.
Thank you, Bruno. Thank you very much. I believe Igor has a question. Igor?
Yeah, thank you, Anna. Well, I would like to hear from Chris, and even maybe by yourself, Anna, but firstly from Chris. One of the key discussions that we are having right now on the legal perspective is regarding force majeure clauses, right? Which could be obviously conveyed into many different aspects. But taking your background and the other jurisdictions that you follow, well, I would like to hear your thoughts on whether, Brazil law or even the contracts being drafted into Brazilian law, do they convey this risk in a much different way than other international practices, and how do you see that being bring into the courts, for decisions and discussions?
That's a great question. I'll defer to Ana Karina, who is also wrestling with some of these issues in Brazil under Brazilian law. But I think you can divide the world into kind of pre-COVID and post-COVID, right, for the answer, Igor. So I think the short answer is pre-COVID, you very rarely explicitly addressed a pandemic. And once it hit, and we certainly wrestled with this a lot in the bring down conditions for, it really fed into whether there's been an MAE or not. And this fed into our analysis of whether we needed to close different transactions that had signed prior to COVID. In most contracts, it was too general in the FM to assert a claim. You really needed to have the government saying, you're shut down. You can't do anything. You needed to have specific provisions that said, if a party is the object of government action, saying, for example, you can't go to the beach. Okay, so, well, that makes it hard to do something which requires the beach, right, to monetize. So if you had a contract that very specifically said it's FM in a pandemic situation, when the government changes the rules and tells you can't do something, right, or shuts down part of your business, I think their parties recognize quickly that's the kind of precision that they needed. But in Brazil, like everywhere, I mean, Brazil is the same as the United States, it's the same as Mexico. We've wrestled with the same issue. No one had really focused on the possibility of a global pandemic with different governments taking different approaches to shutting down different sectors of the economy and impacting transactions. I think now you see people innovating, and in all of these jurisdictions starting to write with much greater precision how to define an event of force majeure, how to limit it to make sure that it truly prevents a party from performing or funding. And people are renegotiating contracts to do that.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Chris. To add to that, from a Brazilian law perspective, I will mention that when we think about force majeure in the Brazilian sector, it would be helpful if we could divide into the different segments of the electric power sector in Brazil. For distribution companies, for instance, the regulator has already, indicated implicitly, that probably no force majeure claims will be accepted or addressed from the perspective of the utilities companies. And the reason for that is that the government will try to mitigate any impacts that COVID-19 will cause or is causing to the distribution companies to other measures such as the COVID-19 account, which was structured, the claims for economic and financial rebalance, as I mentioned, And the reason for that is because there's a clear perception that if a force majeure event is declared at the level of the distribution companies, there will be a severe impact in all the chain of the power sector, right? Because as Lily commented, you know, the distribution company is collecting all the revenues that feed the chain of the power sector, including transmission and generation activities, right? So if a force majeure is declared at the distribution side, it'll be a lot of trouble, you know, to all this system. So there's clearly an intent of the government to not to accept and to avoid any force majeure at the distribution side. On the transmission side, the government has adopted recently, has issued a resolution allowing for greenfield transmission projects to suspend the schedule for implementation of the facilities, you know, which was a very wise decision in my understanding, right? Especially if you have a situation where, you know, the demand has dropped at least for 10%, you know, maybe those transmission facilities don't need to be in place in the original timeline that was agreed, right? So that was a decision taken to suspend the greenfield transmission projects. So, and by that way, avoiding, you know, a force majeure claim, except for certain priority transmission projects, which were, you know, out of the general rule for suspension. And for generation projects, it's still under discussion. It's clear that certain generation projects in the regulated market are suffering a lot to get the project constructed and implemented in the original time frame. There's still not a solution to that. There's expectation that you know, ANEEL will issue regulation allowing generators and utilities companies to renegotiate the schedule of payments under PPAs, but this is still subject to regulation to be issued. But definitely this could be one solution to be adopted in the generation sector.
I mean, Anna Karina, is Chris, it would be important for that to be a feature of future auctions, don't you think? I mean, I think for new investment, to attract new investment into the sector, I think having that feature available is going to be important in the next round of auctions going into next year.
Yeah, definitely. The COVID-19 is bringing a lot of lessons, right, to all of us, and especially to the regulator. Yep. So, John, would you like to jump in now?
Yeah, this is a follow-up for the other question. Again, you've gone through the micro aspects of investing and the regulation part, but the question now is, and certainly listening to Paulo Guedes, he's quite adamant about the necessity of revenue, especially with this huge expansion of the fiscal deficit. A question is, does Congress recognize this? And Adi or whoever else wants to answer, how does this color the investment decision, or at least how the investors are thinking about the sector?
So Adi or Bruno, would you like to take that question?
No one wants to touch it.
I didn't get the question as a whole, but I think I understood. It cut a little bit, but what I can say is, yeah, we have a huge amount of fiscal impact, and what we were doing before the pandemic, we were in a situation that we were reforming the state, and now more than ever, we need to accelerate what we were doing before the pandemic. We will not change what we were doing. So what we have to is to accelerate the privatization, the private investments, and yes, on the end of the day, the Congress, they are together with us. They will approve what is necessary for us to continue and pay the bills and improve the investments. They showed us on the pension reform that we can, on the end of the day, get in good terms what Brazil needs nowadays. So we are very confident with the Congress, and Paulo Guedes, he is pursuing this task with great efforts.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bruno.
No, I think Bruno covered it well. The issues that John brought up are, of course, front of mind. But I think the privatization efforts. It seems like the tax reform should have good prospects over the into next year as well. So it'd be good to see that progress. But yeah, the macro picture certainly factors into our investment decisions.
Thank you, Adi. So I think now we are moving to the end of our webinar. I would ask our panelists maybe to if they want to make a few closing remarks about the discussion today. Maybe Adi, since you are on the spot, would you like to finalize your comments or your contributions?
Yeah, I think Brazil is blessed with tremendous natural resource as we see in hydro and solar and wind, and offshore and with oil and gas. So it's positioned well from an energy and electricity standpoint. So I think that should put it in good stead over the long term. And we're long-term investors, and Brazil is one of the largest economies in the world. So we're going to continue to be active in the market.
Thank you, Adi. Thank you very much for your participation today. Thank you. Igor, would you like to make a few closing remarks?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Anna, and thanks to my fellow panelists and the host. But I think that I also want to leave an optimistic message. So putting this COVID account transaction behind us, what we see moving forward is, in one side, new auctions and new greenfield opportunities. They will take a little bit time until we get there. As Bruno mentioned, we'll have the auction for transmission at the end of the year. Maybe power generation, still not certainty, perhaps next year, let's see. But apart from that, still on the greenfield world, a lot has been done in structure in private transactions among power generation companies and final electricity consumer in the free market. So we are advising many clients closing transactions with very relevant investments on the corporate PPA side, and together with this the whole economic recovery, the whole ESG agenda is getting much more importance than before. So we are very optimistic on that side. And on the other side, also looking on brownfield opportunities, there has been going on some M&A process down the streets. Obviously, some of them got, perhaps postponed or readjusted, but a very few of them got canceled. So the transactions for brownfield acquisitions and releveraging of the assets will also be very important in the upcoming months. And in Brazil, we are entering a momentum of such low level of interest rates that we have never seen before, on which indebtedness, even from private banks, will play a much more important role than it played before for releveraging assets and recycling capital. So also on the brownfield side, we are very optimistic on the upcoming months. And thanks everyone for the opportunity.
Thank you very much, Igor. Lily, you would like to say a few words before we finish? I'm not sure if Lily is still available. Okay, so Chris.
Listen, I'll echo, I think, what Adi and Igor said. We are clients, and we are optimistic about the electricity sector, about the infrastructure generally. And I think we keep talking about regulatory resiliency, contractual resiliency, the benefits and the wealth of Brazil as a nation that it has. But I'd signal one thing, which I think comes out in today's discussion. It's the resiliency of people in Brazil. all the deals that we've continued to work on during COVID, the unflappable, unimpeachable good humor of everybody that's dealing with what they're dealing with, whether in Rio or Sao Paulo or elsewhere, has been extraordinary. And there is a difference between the way people in different countries have approached this. I think it may sound a little bit sentimental, but I think the fact that our Brazilian colleagues have remained so optimistic, despite what's washing through their country now, gives us all a great deal of hope for being able to continue to conduct business and serve the electricity needs of the country as it grows. Thanks.
Jane, thank you, Chris. We always say that we all know about resilience. That's right. You made an excellent point. So finally, I think I would finish with Bruno, right? Bruno, last but not least, I think if you could leave us a few words before we end the debate. Thank you very much for your participation.
Thank you once more. And just a few words as well. We are on the government very optimistic as well, and we're working hard. This optimism is related to what we're working. And there's a lot of opportunities. We will have options. As soon as possible, we will have options. But as Igor said, there are a lot of opportunities nowadays with the mergers and acquisitions, and also with the SOEs of state levels, like I said before, the C3E, that probably will be privatized this year in 2020. And we will resume the auctions as soon as possible on energy sector and other infrastructure that we will deal here in Brazil. We have a huge program in PPI that goes from the mature sector like the power sector, but to nowadays on social infrastructure as well. We are very optimistic, and we will resume the auctions as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruno. I'll now pass to John.
Great. Thank you very much, Ana Karina, and all the panelists for an insightful and timely discussion, and it was a great discussion. Also, thank you again to Machado, Meyer, and Latham Watkins for sponsoring the event. Thank you all for joining as well. We are going to circulate to those that are on Bruno's presentation. We'll also put it up on our website, so you should see that very soon. Next Thursday, the 9th of July, we'll get our third edition of this webinar series, COVID-19 Next Steps, with a discussion of the opportunities and challenges in investing in Brazil's tech sector. Thank you all for attending, and stay healthy and in good spirits. Have a wonderful 4th of July, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Thank you.